Welcome, and my name is Susan Buell, and I thank you for coming. I'm on the art auction and art show committee with Charles Stans back there and Tom Lee right here. So welcome. And today I'm happy and honored to introduce my friend and teacher, Judy Taylor. Most of us have seen Judy's great work, and some of us are lucky enough to own pieces that she has done. And we've appreciated her 10-panel history of labor mural, which in this time is ever more important. I want to say a few words about my experience as a student working with Judy. Judy holds a drop-in drawing class every Sunday, 10 to 12. You're all invited. And we draw with her instruction from the masters. The folks who show up could be graduates of art school, or they could be people like me who show up fresh from 1 10-week senior college class. Judy always finds ways to help, no matter what level. She's always respectful, gracious, generous, and sets that tone for the class. So it's a very, in other words, you don't have very comfortable, very safe place to work, even if you feel you don't know what you're doing. Judy has given me so much, and I am so grateful. So I have a commercial now, because there is an art auction going on here, an art show, and it ends online bidding, and there are people here who can help you access that. Tomorrow at 8. This is a benefit for this library. It happens most every year. These are local artists, some of whom have given their art as a donation to the library. So when you buy it, 100% of the money goes to the library. Some are a 50-50, 50 for the artist, 50 for the library. Also, I need to say that there are questions, please, at the end of Judy's talk. And for folks who are on Zoom, if you can type in your question, and then Kate will read the questions, and Judy can pick up on that. All righty, thank you so much. Can't wait to hear what Judy has to say.
Thank you, Susan, and thanks Kate and Tom. The entire library board, Charles. This is a great library. I have been supporting as much as I can this library creators ever since I did the labor mural, and Julie was extremely helpful in me doing the research around it. So I can do this. Okay, here we go. I'm just going to, this was such a long, I could have spent years on this lecture, and I don't have the time to do that right now. But it's, so what I'm going to show you some videos, some art videos, and one of the reasons I'm going to do that is I love the Khan Academy for Art, and they're very reverential around the art, which I love, and they're very, very good. But it allows you also to see the painting closer up and details of the painting that I don't necessarily have in the slideshow. And then we'll have a discussion about some things about it. I've got a lot on the plate. I'm going to try and keep the time within the time frame, so we might miss the last video. But I think everything's going to be recorded, so you can go. Every year I take students to London and Paris to draw in the museums. And this is a painting in the Petit Plat in Paris, which is a fantastic museum. This painting is probably the size of this entire wall. and it's by Ferdinand Pelez. And he really went out to the streets and painted many of the normal people on the streets, right? This is a carnival scene. It's meant to be as if you were walking by on the street, you were walking by the carnival. Okay, so you have, and it's maybe they're 30 seconds before they're going to be showing. So here are the young people. There's so many different things you can see about this painting. Young, it's also could be like the three ages of man. Young, midlife, older. That's one interpretation. So it's almost, I wouldn't say it's lifestyle, but the figures are quite large. So it's meant to be viewed as if you're walking along. The children are extremely tired, bored. I mean, I think it's just a fantastic painting. And some of the people here have seen it in life. So never heard of him until I went to Paris. So it's a big revelation. It's an incredible painting. It did travel the United States. It was at the Met about 8 years ago in a show. So we'll move quickly along. So I'm going to show you some preliminary portraits because they're going to fold into some of the video later. This is Henry James, a very well-known writer, and also a very close friend of John Singer Sargent for 40 years. And if you ever had the opportunity to read some of the letters that they wrote to each other back and forth, it's really interesting. This portrait was flashed at the National Gallery in London during the women's suffragette movement in London. Many paintings were, as I'm sure you've all seen the no oil controversies that are going on, seem to have stopped for a little bit. But the women, this was actually an elderly woman came in and she was caught slashing Henry James's portrait. So, and then the sideways, Roque Velasquez, who I'm talking about a lot today, his Roque Venus was also in the National Gallery, and a woman came in to slash it, a suffragette. And the floors had just been waxed. So the guards saw her and ran across to stop her, but fell on the wax floor. So that had extensive damage to it, but both have been restored and they are, of course, back up in the nest. And actually, Sargent restored this himself. He was still living. This was Henry James a year before his death. So you can, and very famous portrait for painters or the figure. This is like one of the top. This is Velasquez Juan de Pareja. He was born in Seville, Spain, and he was born as a slave. And so he came under the tutelage at some point with Velasquez. There's so many different stories of how he won his freedom, but apparently Philip IV saw his work and he said somebody that talented should never be a slave. Well, other than the reason that nobody should ever be a slave anyway. But anyway, so he worked with Velasquez and he was a wonderful painter himself. But it's a beautiful portrait. It's at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I mean, when I was studying in New York, we wanted to go look at a perfect painting. That's where we would go. And okay, this is, the reason I'm showing you this is Philip IV, who was, Velasquez was the court painter to Philip IV. Juan de Pareja was also in that court. So Velasquez painted Philip IV over and over and over again. And the reason I'm showing this is young Philip, and the last picture he did of Philip IV. This is in the National Gallery. I'm not quite sure where this one is. But it's a great thing to look at a first portrait, and then as the artist progresses in their career and the people age, like Rembrandt did many self-portraits as he aged, the change. You still got the big lantern, Habsburg jaw. This painting, if you stand in front of this painting, it's breathing. It is one of the most beautifully, not a great looking guy, right? But the painting is so beautiful. And of course, this is so beautifully rendered, but it shows so much from youth to this kind of sad wisdom, or maybe not wisdom, I don't know how smart he was, but anyway, Velasquez was the painter, so we'll go on because he's going to figure in all the rest of the stuff. We'll move on, Kate. I just love this painting. It was recently acquired by the Frick Museum, but it's a portrait of a woman Giovanni Battista Moroni. This was in the 1500s, but it's such an exquisite portrait. I just decided to throw it up there. You can see that at the Frick, which has been completely renovated, and it's supposed to be a revelation. So, and this is Elizabeth Garrett Anderson by John Singer Sargent. I put her in because she was a very prominent suffragette, and she was also the first woman to be a doctor in London, to be certified as a physician. Okay, then we go on to Charles Darwin. This is painted a year before he died. I have 2 notes, but I want to go through those. It was by John Collier, and John Collier was the son-in-law of another prominent late Victorian scientist, Thomas Henry Huxley. Have you heard of him? And the portrait was presented to the gallery by Darwin's oldest son, William Erasmus Darwin. And it looks like Darwin had 3 sons. I'm asking David Valley because his portrait is coming up next, and he is a geneticist from Johns Hopkins, and he knows Darwin pretty good, right? So let's just go to this is this is at the National Portrait Gallery in London, which also is being redone. So this is my portrait of David Valley for Johns Hopkins University. Johns Hopkins, McCusick, right? Genetics.
The Department of Genetics.
Department of Genetic Medicine. So I neglected to talk about symbolism in a portrait before later because I'm trying to rush through to get everything in. But a lot of times there's indications of what the person is in the portraiture itself, what they're about, what part of society that they come from. So here I have Charles Darwin, because I think he was a big factor in your studies. And back here is Bass Harbor Marsh, because Dave and his wife Sue have a property on Mount Desert Island, and Dave is a wonderful black and white and color photographer. And so I wanted to show that that's a loon flying over Bass Harbor Marsh to indicate his roots to Maine. Down here is a kestrel. Dave's a big birder. And this was, okay, maybe Dave can explain. I think it's something I pulled from Darwin. And this is
The I think is from Darwin's notebook, and it's thought to be when the idea of natural selection first dawned on him. So he said, I think, and then he goes on to say that the individuals who are the strongest of their species are more likely to reproduce and pass things on to the next generation. Darwin himself knew nothing about genetics, so that was a real weakness in his theory, but he had the idea right. And
this with your writing.
that is my hand and writing and making a pedigree, since I'm a geneticist, and so much of what we do is based on analyzing families. And
the child.
that's a little boy at the time, obviously, who was a patient of mine. He's now grown up and doing very well. But I consider myself a physician scientist, so I wanted to have something from medicine and something from the sort of evolutionary science. Darwin promoted the idea of variation. And then if you think about it, that helps to explain why some people get sick and other people don't. You know, you have 2 people in the same room and they get exposed to someone with COVID, and one who gets COVID and gets very sick and the other one doesn't. And so to understand medicine, you need to understand why different ones get sick and others don't.
Yeah. That's a huge rabbit. Okay, thanks, Dave. And it's so great to have Dave come some of my drop-in drawing classes. And last week, or a couple weeks ago, we were drawing a dwarf that Augustus had painted. So Dave was all giving us all the genetic information about it. So this is an older painting by Hans Holbein the Younger. He figures in too, but this is referencing certain things. She's holding a squirrel. Her last name was Harling, and so the starling is next to it in reference to her name, and the squirrel is in reference to her family's, what are they called? Insignia crest. So her family crest, but I just want to show that as another element of symbolism. Okay. This is just a closer version. So Mark Anderson was the third physician that I painted for Johns Hopkins. He was in the Department of Medicine, head of the Department of Medicine at Hopkins. He's now at the University of Chicago. So at the time, Mark was responsible for navigating the medical department through COVID. So we had a big discussion on what would be in the background. He's also a teaching physician, correct? So these are his students. And this is the facade of Johns Hopkins. This is a molecule that Mark has been working on for over 30 years. And this is the COVID symbol. So also he was the first physician in the Department of Medicine that we agreed we would ditch the tie. That a thank you clap, I love that, you know. So yeah, so there we go. Oh, this guy. I was drawing in the National Portrait Gallery with my students, and one of the other great things about drawing there is you get guides that come in and are talking about a painting. So this guy was talking to his group about this painting, and I just could not believe it. This is Lieutenant General Sir Adrian Carton de Wiart, the unkillable soldier. Shot 27 times, lost an arm. This guy is going, and he lost his arm, and then he's going, and then he lost his eye. And then he survived 2 plane crashes, escaped from a POW camp twice. He was a soldier for the British Empire, fought in 6 major wars, was shot in the face, head, stomach, ankle, leg, hip, lost part of his ear, blinded in his eye, and survived 2 plane crashes. Tunneled out of a POW camp and tore off 2 of his fingers when a doctor refused to amputate them. Born to Belgian Irish parents, he remained a Belgian citizen for several of his until he became a British citizen. His father sent him to law school, but he enlisted in the British Army at 20 instead. He lost his eye in a war against the Somali in Africa when shot in the face. By the time World War I started, he had already developed a reputation as a man who ate fire. In every action, he actively participated and was seen grabbing grenade pins out with his teeth and throwing them with one good arm. When World War II began, he was already in Poland when the fighting began, and from then on, he was sent to various theaters, ending up being captured in Italy in 1943. He remained a key figure during the post-war period as well, especially in China. He eventually retired to Ireland and at 83 died in 1963. And, you know, if you want to get his book, it's called Happy Odyssey. Happy Odyssey. So, not the greatest portrait in the world. It's a very nice portrait, but
What is his name again?
Sir Adrian Carton de Wiart, 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 maybe. Okay, there it is. So we were, and it's gobsmacked as you listen to this guy song, and you're going, oh, and then, okay, then we'll move on. This is Sargent in his studio, of course, painting Manet, and so I'm going to show a video of, further paint, please, the painting of Manet, and also in companionship with that, the painting of the next one, Dr. Pozzi, who was a prominent gynecologist in Paris. So here we go.
Impressionist obsession with color theory. Plus, of course, Sargent used the color black, unlike the Impressionists. He was just more interested in tonal values and, in the end, accurate representation. He may have used abstract brushstrokes, but he combined it with a hyper-realism that the Impressionists rejected. It's hard to look at this painting without the feeling one is being seduced. Samuel Jean Pozzi was one of the most fascinating and notorious men in Paris. He was a 35-year-old gynecologist to the stars, good-looking, dynamic, and charismatic in the extreme. He was a married man with a family, but he was also a womanizer, infamous for his numerous affairs, including with the legendary actress Sarah Bernhardt, Bizet's widow, the poet Judith Gautier, and several actresses and dancers. He was described by the Princess of Monaco as disgustingly handsome, and by a contemporary as a beautiful work of art himself. It is as a prodigious lover we know him now, thanks to the notoriety of Sargent's portrait. But we mustn't forget that Dr. Pozzi was actually a brilliant 19th century Renaissance man. He was catapulted from provincial bourgeois beginnings to the upper echelons of Parisian society, and rose quickly through the ranks by his intelligence and charm. He was a surgeon and a pioneering gynecologist, a writer, an author and a translator. He was an anthropologist who travelled widely in North Africa and South America. And most importantly, he was also an art collector and patron of the arts. Sargent met Pozzi in 1881 and started work on the painting. There were plenty of portraitists in Paris at the time, and Sargent knew he needed an edge to stand out. The risk-taking and unmasculine poses and attire made sure Sargent was noticed early on, and Dr. Pozzi liked a risk. The composition departs significantly from the usual formal academic portraits of medical doctors, and is certainly different from the way Pozzi presented himself to the public. The portrait, with its strange clothing and seductive quality, comes across as more of a boudoir portrait. Sargent's mainstream sensuousness has always been recognised, and scholars have said that the image flirts between heterosexual and homosexual desire. The artist's private life is not necessarily the key to his work, but as with all artists, it is important to look at the world he inhabited. Little is known about Sargent's personal life, as he destroyed many of his private papers. But in 1981, a full century after he created them, a portfolio of intimate nude males in sensual or erotic poses was discovered. He had given it to his friend Isabella Stewart Gardner for safekeeping. He knew they would be seen after his death. What those daring images tell us is that Sargent had a need to push the boundaries of what was considered acceptable in art, and that is precisely what makes him so interesting. In the portrait of Dr. Pozzi, his swagger is unmistakably sexual. He is oozing sex appeal. His bedroom eyes look dreamily into the distance, and his neatly trimmed beard and pomaded hair suggest a familiarity with his own reflection. Portrait painting at the time dictated that formal dress was worn, but Sargent had already broken this unwritten rule with an earlier portrait where the sitter is rather saucily dressed in an unbuttoned shirt.
Booking.com has all kinds of stays because some love
Yeah. Here we go.
a sunny resort, others not so much.
And is posing in a Velázquez swagger. In Dr. Pozzi at home, the outfit and the colour are quite shocking. He is in a dressing gown of the brightest crimson, suggestive of passion. His left hand sits limply on his hip, and he fingers a red cord with a dangling tassel hanging heavily between his legs, as if he may open the robe to the viewer at any point. The other hand languidly caresses his chest. It is a provocative pose, even for the 21st century. Beneath the gown, his nightshirt is dazzlingly white and romantically Byronesque. The red robe gives him a Renaissance magnificence and references images of popes and cardinals by the old masters. The pose is utterly self-assured and commanding, and could have been modelled after El Greco's portrait of a man, which Sargent knew well. It is the gynecologist's hands which are the focal point of the composition. Sargent's depiction of hands in his paintings are considered some of the most skillful and expressive portrayal of hands in the history of Western art. He tended to bend, twist or contort fingers and hands into unusual and sometimes impossible positions, using hands to suggest the character and temperament of his subjects, using subtle variations in posture, gesture and expression to create a sense of psychological depth and complexity. In his wonderful portrait of Robert Louis Stevenson, for example, Sargent portrays the subject's hands in a way that suggests both creativity and fragility, with the fingers delicately posed as if in the act of creating. This painting of the French artist Paul Ehlers, records the precise and delicate pose of the artist's hand as he applies paint to his canvas with intense concentration. Dr. Pozzi's hands are tapering and sensitive, with long busy fingers that suggest his surgical prowess as a gynecologist, but also hint at the more sensual side of Dr. Pozzi. Sargent, aware that the painting of Dr. Pozzi was perhaps too salacious, decided against showing it in Paris where he lived and instead decided to show it in London. The painting got mostly hostile reviews. British critics found it objectionably Parisian, too decadent, too en vogue. One critic even hinted it was effeminate. The portrait ranks amongst Sargent's most experimental works, rivaled only by his infamous Madame X. Madame X would be Sargent's most ambitious work to date. It would change the course of both his life and his subject, and yet it almost didn't happen. His sitter, the 23-year-old Virginie Gautreau, was a figure of fashionable high society, the it girl of her day, and she was famous for being infamous. Sargent was determined to produce something for the 1884 Salon just as unconventional as his Dr. Pozzi, who would even be a factor in choosing her. This was not going to be one of his usual empathetic renderings of a woman, but something much more stagey. He would portray her as a diva, and he would capitalize on her notoriety. Like Sargent, Gautreau was an American expatriate from a wealthy family. Her father was killed during the American Civil War, and she and her mother moved to Paris, where Virginie's strange beauty and natural grace made sure she married well, to a prosperous but boring banker. She wasn't conventionally beautiful, even for the time, but with her alabaster skin, red upswept hair and shapely figure, she was undeniably striking. She skirted the fringes of bohemian Paris and was constantly featured in gossip magazines like L'Illustration, thanks to her many extramarital love affairs. Sargent met her in 1880 when he painted Dr. Pozzi, who was one of her lovers. In Parisian society, it was perfectly acceptable for married women to have affairs, as long as one was discreet about it. The first thing to understand is that she didn't commission the painting. It was Sargent who pursued her. Initially, Madame Gautreau was not interested at all, and it took months of persuasion, with several of her friends approached by Sargent, and a word in her ear from Dr. Pozzi. Everyone wanted to paint her, and everyone wanted to meet her. The artist and the subject must have recognized in each other a like-minded hunger for fame, and she eventually agreed in early 1883, but insisted Sargent came to her estate in Brittany to paint her. As it wasn't a commissioned work and she had done the artist a favour, he had no choice. The whole process was difficult. She sat for a few drawings, but it took over 30 sessions to find an effective pose, settling on one that captured her famous profile. As always, Sargent's palette and brushwork were inspired by Velázquez, and his chiaroscuro by artists like Titian. In fact, Sargent had originally emphasized the light-dark contrast even more, with a much darker background. Unhappy with it, he painted over with the more neutral colour that we see today. If you look carefully though, you can see traces of the darker background along the frame's edge, because he repainted while the portrait was still framed. Another inspiration was Japanese prints, which were becoming increasingly fashionable in Europe during the late 19th century. Madame X incorporates elements that are similar to Japanese aesthetics, such as the use of asymmetry and the emphasis on negative space, her stark black clothes and the minimalistic background. Sargent's depiction of her skin tone was criticised at the time for its powder blue pallor, and some said she looked like she was decomposing. Gautreau was actually a Louisianan Creole of mixed European heritage and was often mistaken for a South American, then considered exotic. According to the artist, it was her use of chlorate of potash powder and arsenic that gave her skin a lavender tinge. Her ears have been touched with rouge to denote blushing, a fashion in those days, but one that would lead to more accusations of her being a painted lady. One member of the tabloid press even suggested it was a post-coital flush. It's hard to make out, but she is wearing the tiniest of tiaras, barely there, in the shape of a crescent moon, the symbol of Diana, the goddess of the hunt, perhaps referencing her supposedly predatory nature as a huntress-seductress. Another detail is the table legs, which taper upwards into winged sirens or femme fatales from Greek mythology, who plunge sailors to their doom. And while we are here, let's look at how Sargent depicts the light hitting the edge of the table so realistically. But up close, it is just a single slash of his brush. And her wedding ring, which added to the scandal, is really just one tiny dab of paint, but from a distance reads perfectly as a wedding ring. Our eyes do the rest. In this photo of the painting taken at the time of the Paris opening, we see that he originally painted her with the strap of her gown falling off her shoulder. It was this detail that caused such an outcry. The loose strap was seen as a signifier of loose morals, suggesting either the beginning or the end of a sexual liaison. Only later, when the exhibition closed, and after much pleading from Madame Gautreau's mother, did Sargent repaint that section, but by then the damage was done. It is worth looking at what women were wearing at the time, in two portraits painted by Sargent in the same year he painted Madame X. The scandal started on the opening night. Sargent had always been the darling of the salon, feted by everybody. But not this time. Crowds gathered around the painting and jeered. They shouted that it was detestable, monstrous. It is genuinely hard to see what the fuss was about. 20 years before, in 1865, Manet had shown Olympia at the Salon to a scandalized Paris. So why the shock now? The difference was that Manet's Olympia...
I'm going to show that painting a little later so we can move on. Boy, would I love to get a portrait commission from the university where they would wear a red robe. This is another beautiful Sargent. This is actually in a private collection, but it was at the Museum of Fine Arts and also at the Tate Britain when they had a big Sargent exhibition. So I got to see it. I had never seen that Sargent, and it's exquisite. So that's just wanted to show that. Now here's Sargent's. This is a painting of Sargent's teacher, and I just wanted to show you the difference between a photograph and a painting, if you can see that. The painting, of course, is from life, and now we use photographs to help us with portraiture because most people do not want to sit for weeks on end. So I just thought it was interesting to show the Caron as his teacher. Okay. Now here's the Manet painting. So we'll just have our wonderful lecturers tell you about it. Is everybody familiar with this painting? It was in New York a few years ago, but it's
There's a long tradition of the female nude represented in the most erotic, sensuous way, clothed by mythology or clothed by sheer beauty.
It's a tradition that goes back to the ancient Greeks and Romans in sculptures, for example, of the goddess Venus modestly covering her body after her bath. And Manet, in this painting that we're looking at here at the Musée d'Orsay, is clearly drawing on those traditions, but doing something radically modern.
The immediate model for Manet was Titian's Venus of Urbino, except he's stripping away the academic technique of the representation of space, of the turn of the body, but he's also stripping away that veil of mythology. So by academic art, we're talking about the kind of art that was sanctioned by the official academy that was associated with the government of France.
It didn't challenge particularly, it satisfied.
For one, because it had the stamp of the official state. These were the leading artists of the time that were saying this art is of quality, and so of course it had a ready market value. But at the same time, it was art that was formulaic, that was expected.
Well, there was an idea that there was a definition of great art. And there was no point in looking for what was new or different, because what great art was self-evident. Great art was based on the classical and the Renaissance. And what someone like Manet is doing is challenging those very established ideas that seemed as natural as the sun coming up in the morning. She's not a Venus. Her name is Olympia, and she looks very much like a real woman in a real apartment in Paris.
So how do you know she looks like a real woman as opposed to a Venus?
Her features are not idealized. They're not perfected. When we look at ancient Greek sculpture or Renaissance paintings of the nude, we have a woman who's perfectly beautiful, and you can see her face is asymmetrical and her lips are a little bit too thin. She doesn't have that perfection.
In addition, the representations of the academic artists always show Venus or other nudes in a coy way. This woman is looking directly at us. She is sentient, she is thinking, and she's confronting us even as we look at her.
And so there was a real problem for the viewers of this painting. There's no way to look at her and pretend that it was about beauty. One was confronted by her sexuality.
This woman was recognized as a courtesan, that is, as a kind of prostitute.
The name Olympia was common for prostitutes at that time in Paris.
And what we're seeing here is Olympia's servant handing her flowers that presumably have just come from one of her customers. But look at the way that Olympia's looking out towards us. We must have, as the customer, walked into the room and startled the cat at the foot of the bed, as well as the two figures.
When we use the word prostitute, we think of a figure of much lower class, and here we have a woman who's a higher class prostitute.
Important new scholarship has helped us to better understand one of the two primary figures in this painting.
New scholarship by Denis Morel helps us see that this is part of his attempt to capture modern life in Paris, and modern life in Paris was decidedly diverse.
And Morel's research opens up this painting. It tells us that this is a painting that is not just a reprise of the Venus in Titian's Venus of Urbino, but it expresses modernity in its inclusion of a black woman, a woman who had posed for him for a gorgeous portrait, and even before that, on the side of a painting of children in the Tuileries Gardens.
There was a small black community in the northern part of Paris, but after 1848, when territorial slavery was finally outlawed in France, that population grew. And Laure lived only 20 minutes away from Manet and close to many of the other painters and prominent artists of the time.
And look at the way that Manet paints Laure in relationship to Olympia. Olympia is static, almost like a sculpture, whereas Laure seems to be momentary, seems to be a part of the modern world, seems to be in motion.
We do not know Laure's last name. We think that she was likely from the Caribbean or from Africa, but Laure is mostly lost to history.
And importantly, this scholarship notes that Manet has dressed her in modern clothing, but with a reference still to the Caribbean, and that can be seen in her head wrap.
Most images at this time of black figures were either exoticized, romanticized, or they're ethnographic. In other words, they are an attempt to capture a certain type. But Manet seems more interested in presenting Laure as a modern black woman in Paris.
The reaction of the press was pretty vicious.
The press said Olympia looked like a cadaver. Manet outlined her in black and hardly modeled her flesh.
Some of the caricatures that were made of this emphasize the shadow on her hands and feet, and some of the press actually spoke of her hands being filthy. And it's interesting that those are the only areas where there's significant modeling.
Where one would expect to see modeling on the female nude would be in the abdomen, around the breasts. And here Manet's kept that really flat. The areas that we do see shadow are unexpected, so that press interpreted her hand as drawing attention to her sexuality, even though nudes for centuries had shown women with their hand placed across their genitals.
You mentioned the kind of flatness of her body, and some art historians have even said she's a bit of a paper cutout. Manet, in so much of his work, really does reject the clear articulation of represented space and confronts the viewer with the complexity of painting on a two-dimensional surface. And an area where you can really see that are, for instance, in the way the toes peek out from under her slipper. there is this awkwardness that reminds us that all of this is illusion and that in fact there is just this two-dimensionality of this canvas.
Manet is saying, I'm not going to pretend that my painting isn't paint. I'm not going to present you with this perfect illusion, the way that academic artists are doing, where you don't even see a brushstroke. So he's insisting on unmasking that illusion. And then he's insisting on unmasking the illusion of our own interests in looking at these images. He's reminding us that our interest here is a sexual one.
Right, in so many traditional representations of the nude, because the figure is not looking out at us, we can comfortably look at her. But here we're confronted by her gaze and by her thinking, and there is a much more problematic experience here.
And that's in the fact that she's a real woman, she's contemporary, and the way she picks her head up, the way she looks out at us, the angularity of her body. And people at the time in 1865 recognized it.
So this is a painting that is about art making and about the kinds of conventions that exist in art and making us, the viewer, aware of those conventions even as we look at this painting.
Manet is saying, let's be honest about the materials. Let's be honest about the subject and our own motives and desires. The great poet and art critic Charles Baudelaire called on artists to paint the beauty of modern life, and I think Manet is taking up that call.
Manet is inventing what beauty could be for the modern world.
I just remember back in the slide where at the time of Manet and the Impressionists, the Japanese art was making a big presence in Paris. And the flat picture plane and the kind of outline was also very, very influential to the painters. You know, we get Degas and all that for that kind of reference. So, the Folie Bergère, which is also by Manet. This is, I think, almost his last painting that he painted. Some people think of it as a, his last big painting before he was going to die. He knew he was very sick. He was sick for about 3 years. But I'm going to look down and tell you a little bit about it. It's one of my favorite paintings. Actually, when I was studying in New York, I was hired by a restaurant with Felix to copy this, to put in the restaurant. And it was a really great learning experience because painters routinely copy painters to learn, to learn. That's how you learn. And that's why I do, really take people to look at the masters. So, yeah.
We're in the Courtauld Galleries looking at Manet's bar at the Folies Bergère.
This is a painting that takes place in a cafe concert, a bar with entertainment, but the entertainment was a little more circus-like than we're used to.
You can get a sense of that in the top left corner where we see the calves and feet of an acrobat. This was a place for middle-class entertainment that was a little grittier.
The painting at first seems very straightforward. We seem to be looking at a woman who's looking back at us, and there's the entertainment just behind her. But when we look a little bit more closely, you notice that what we're seeing, in fact, is a reflection. She stands in front of a mirror.
And one of the ways that I can see that most easily is by looking at the gold frame of the mirror.
The mirror is a reminder that a canvas has for so long been seen as a way of reflecting the world in a true sense. Manet's project is to undermine that very old conceit.
And I'm reminded that we're looking at a Manet immediately because of the gaze of the woman in the painting, which is so forthright and so direct, but at the same time so unreadable. And that reminds me of earlier paintings by Manet like Olympia or the Déjeuner sur l'herbe. Unlike his Impressionist colleagues, Manet is interested in the human figure in modern life.
And Manet, who had been such an inspiration for the Impressionists, is here also responding to the advances that they made.
The openness of the brushwork and the chandelier might remind us of Renoir's painting of the Moulin de la Galette, for example.
At the extreme right, right, we see the reflection of the back of the woman that we're facing, but we also see that she's facing a male figure who wears a top hat, clearly a patron of this café concert.
And he seems to be close to her, as though he's engaged in conversation or asking for a drink.
And so that must be us, and at the same time, it can't be us because we're looking directly at her and the reflection is off at the side. So clearly there is some willful distortion on the part of the artist.
We know that there was willful distortion because we also have sketches that Manet made that we can compare it to.
Manet is deliberately transforming his initial sketch in such a way as to upend our expectations of what this painting should be showing us.
This was in the Salon of 1882, and people who went to the Salon had expectations of paintings, and one of those expectations was that you could read the painting. It was legible. You could understand your relationship as the viewer to the figures in the painting and the relationship of the figures to one another. And Manet is confounding both of those.
Which itself can be read as an aspect of modernity. This is all taking place within a new urban context, a new Paris that had recently been reconstructed, where people of different classes come into contact with each other.
In the modern world, we tend to want to categorize people. It helps us to sort out the world that we live in when we're in an urban environment. And Manet is insistently refusing to give us a type of person that we can categorize with certainty. There was already an uncertainty and a danger around women in the city. So a woman at a bar would have been understood as being somewhat sexually available.
If she was alone, and certainly if she was working there. So when we take on the physical manifestation of the man with the top hat and we look directly at her, we put ourselves in the position of the patron in this bar. The question of her availability to us is put front and center.
Is she flirting with us? Is she keeping a kind of distant reserve?
Manet has placed her firmly on the other side of a marble slab that seems impenetrable.
And yet, if we look at the reflection, there is a closeness there that seems very at odds with the distance that we feel in front of the painting.
The marble bar that separates us from this woman has almost vanished in the reflection at the extreme right.
She's unavailable to us in that sensual way. But the bottles and the fruit and the glasses, they're painted in an incredibly sensual way.
So Manet is denying us a closeness that we see in the reflection behind us, all across the cafe, where we see couples mingling.
It makes us uncomfortable. What is our relationship? What will this interaction be like when we approach her and ask for a drink?
Look at her eyes. They seem to be at odds with the representation of the mouth. The mouth seems to have a little bit of a sneer to it, where the eyes feel sadder.
In the sketch, she stands with her hands clasped in front of her torso. But in the final painting, Manet made her lean forward slightly by placing her hands on that bar. And although that makes us expect her to be a little bit closer to us, there still seems to be a distance in her torso. So again, that tension between distance and closeness.
Manet shows his virtuosity, not only in the face, but also in the two blossoms right before us, or for instance in the cut glass which has the fruit.
Manet, as usual, is drawing our attention to the fact that this is paint on a canvas, an image which is flat. He's denying that desire for an illusion of reality that was also such an important expectation of the salon goer. There are some passages, especially in the reflection, where all we're seeing is just touches of blacks and grays and browns and beiges, a quick, loose handling of paint that is a metaphor, I think, for the dynamism and the sense of movement and energy in the new modern city of Paris.
So, Augustus, Sargent, Manet. I just want to show, I'm really running out of time, and I know we have to wrap it up. But so maybe I'll just verbally talk about, this is Velasquez's Las Meninas and the Prado, and I wish they had time to put the video, but I really don't think we will, but maybe, I can, you can have the references and everything will be, but here's the Velasquez painting. What's happening is there's also, this is considered one of the greatest paintings of all time. Right here is the mirror. Is he painting the king and queen? And has the princess entered the room right at the moment, and he is pausing in his painting of the king and queen, who would be kind of around here painting. That is pretty much accepted um, uh, description of it. So here is a Princess Isabella, and these are her ladies in waiting. These are her. This is a dwarf that is really responsible for her, like her major babysitter. And this is her playmate, who's also a dwarf. The dog is usually an indication of fidelity in paintings. Back here you have her nurse and another member of the household. And right here is Count Oliveres, who was Philip IV's right-hand military man. But it's just a magnificently composed painting, and I hope that you get to see it in the flesh sometime, because this does nothing to it. And Velasquez has a emblem on his thing that was just given to people of it was like getting a very high award, and that had just been recently given to him. So he was actually showing that off a little bit, but he's pausing. His brushwork is pausing because the teaching of Velasquez and Sargent and Manet is to pause, look, apply. Look, apply. It's not just so that indicates his manner of painting. So any questions on that? But I'd like to show you one more painting in the same spirit and genre of this. Look that one up. That's if you can go to the video at some point at home, it's worth, you can Google that very easily. Okay. So when I'm in, I just showed this is a photo I took in London, because you're not supposed to photograph the children, and I know that. But to me, that was Las Molinas right there. The way she was dressed, the way she was just, I mean, to me that child was indicative of all those paintings that we've seen, and one that we're going to see coming up is the Daughters of Edward Darley Boyd, which is at the Museum of Fine Arts. So we can see if that comes up. Okay, there it is. This is by Sargent. All these were influenced by Las Molinas, and it took Edward Darley Boyd, their father, was also a painter. So he kind of got that he would let Sargent do something unusual with the composition. And there you go. And it's a great painting. And there's all these psychological stories of what happened to all four of these girls that you can look up, which is really pretty fascinating. And recently, I don't know who's been to the MFA recently, but I think they reacquired those vases and they're in front of the painting now. So, but it's a magnificent story of allowing the portrait artists to do what they do, right? To let them do their job. So we can go on, Kate. Okay, so this is the famous painting by Velasquez, a portrait of Innocent X. And then when I painted, this wasn't in my head when I painted Dr. Barton Childs at Johns Hopkins, a leading geneticist, but that was my painting of Barton. And that was my first portrait commission by the university. And Barton was 92 when I painted this. He had 70 years of students, pretty much. And the committee, there's a committee that formed, and his wife had, also thought everybody knew Barton without a beard. So there was some discussion, can you do the painting from a photograph? You can do it when he was younger, and I needed the commission, I needed it. And I said, no. I want to paint him as he is, and I was supported by David and Barton both. So this is the painting of it. And around here, so I solved that problem by showing Barton different times of his career without a beard. And this was his mentor, one of his mentors, and Garrett. And gosh, I wonder if he was related to Garrett, that woman physician in London. Because you go and you get all these connections and everything. When I went into his office, I went down to Johns Hopkins, and Barton came all the way downstairs and escorted me up to the office with Dave, who was taking the pictures. And on the walls of his office were all these National Geographic things that he had torn out of newspaper magazines and taped to the wall, and they were all of animals and the babies. And he was a leading child geneticist. So incorporated that mother barking at her little cub. And these were 3 children that he worked on when he was, and I can't place it, this a clinic down in the south, I believe. And I think that he told me they had weight. So I just incorporated these 3, these background to show the history of art. He's was a pretty neat guy. But what I really found interesting is he became this leading geneticist, but he was adopted as a baby. I just thought that was, I don't know why I thought that was fascinating. Because probably putting, you know, he didn't know his own genealogy, right?
Not officially, at least.
Yeah. Okay, so we can go. Oh, okay. Last story. This is a woman. So they've been taking some of the really great women painters at the time of the turn of the 19th, 20th century out of the vaults and putting back into the museums because there were so many great painters. This is Gwen John, and the next one is her brother, Augustus John. When they were children, they were brought up in a fairly middle-class family. And when they were children, even when they were like 2 and 4, they were drawing together all the time. So Augustus went to, when he was, I think, 18, 17 or 18, moved to the Slade School in London and started his training. At that time, the Slade School was starting to accept women into the classes because before women could not study the figure, they couldn't study with men in the same class. So he wrote to Gwen. Gwen came to London and they were both at the Slade School, and that's where their careers just, you know, started. They both started. Augustus being male, his career kind of increased, but she was really, really dedicated to art. There's a new book out about them right now that just came out, and I really want to read it because they were fascinating. He, well, one thing said he fathered, I mean, this is like sex education. The one fathered 100 children, but anyway, he married, he was in a very, he had a second wife that they traveled in a caravan like gypsies. He was really drawn to gypsies, and he was a very, very good painter. And then Gwen moved to Paris, and because she wasn't making as much of a living as Augustus, she had to work. So she hired herself out as a model, and one of her was Rodin, and they started an affair, and she was his mistress. 23, 65, I don't know. Anyway, but he was actually very good to her. So that's all I can have time to tell you, but I would get that book. Their life story is really interesting. But isn't that a beautiful painting? It's by Sir William Orpen, who was a friend of his. And we can just, I think we should finish it up. Oh, Hans Holbein, I got some on that too, but that's a great painting. So big story, lots of science references, and as you can tell, they traveled the world. Apparently, the skull is very famous because if you look at it in one way, it becomes a full skull. Yeah, so let me just wrap it up, Kate. We'll just go through ambassadors. Those are 4 portraits I did of sisters, and one's a cousin. And I'll just go through these really fast, Kate. This is the same, this is Patrick, and when he was 6, I had to bribe him to go to Brooklyn to a studio and sit for me for an hour and a half. That's what he did when he was 6, and then this is when he was 13, so, but he sat, yeah. Now their marriage, the very famous marriage portrait, and I love this painting. The Russians were really good painters, they still are. Anyway, let's move on. It's a painting I did about one of my models now. The painting, this is Seal Harper. Yeah. So, yeah, next thing. So this is a painting of my brother's partner who had died. His name was Fabio. He was a concert pianist. So this is kind of a painting to honor Fabio. He's back here, he's playing a concert, and both of his children were brought up to play the piano. It's a painting I did of a young man in New York City. Right. Three of my nieces, I just asked them to, I don't know, call this the three muses. So, we keep going, great. This is out in Bass Harbor on the moon, Molly. My name's Molly. Yeah. So this is, I forgot the name of the artist, but it's, you know, I show this because it's a tribute to a marriage or a relationship. And then the next one, Kate, is, I did this painting of people for their 50th anniversary, wedding anniversary. Wow, so we can wrap it up, Kate, yeah. This is Katie Baxter's, two grandsons. Oh. Well, I don't know how he got it. All right, that's it. Any questions?
It was the second slide you showed. And you said, this is a perfect painting.
One day, yeah.
What in your mind makes a painting the perfect portrait or perfect?
It's so adeptly painted. The understanding of light is incredible. And Velasquez really painted like the person was. You could feel that person's, they were alive. Very, very natural. Painted under natural light. It's and that's everybody that's a figurative and portrait can a lot of people. We just looked at that as an extreme. If you have to see the painting, it's like the Met. You have to see it how incredibly facile it is. Beautiful. You don't paint like that by just, you know, messing around. Oh. Any other questions? No. Thank you so much for coming. Yeah.